and see how it relates to us at this present time. The reason we can do this is because our brains have changed little in that 200 to 400 years. Therefore, the mental processes of the people who owned the objects in the exhibit was much like our own. My background in neuroscience and my passion as a collector of Chinese porcelain led me to combine the two as I learned about the pieces I was collecting. When I was asked to be guest curator for an exhibit at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, now Newfields, featuring my collection, it gave me an opportunity to share what I learned. The title of my exhibit, Elegance from the East, New Insights into Old Porcelain, was meant to combine the taste that the old objects represented in earlier times with new insights from modern knowledge. This approach gives us a chance to learn about science through the visuals that art offers, a more easily digestible approach than a purely didactic one. The exhibit was held in the Lilly House, which is on the grounds of the Indianapolis Museum of Art, part of Newfields. If you notice the second floor here, it's quite extensive. And it was in the 6 rooms in the second floor that my exhibit was held. The fact that there was so much room there meant that it accommodated nearly 100 pieces. Though galleries are named for the objects within, we also will be concentrating on the concepts that each gallery portrays through art, each of which relates to us today. Pleasure, pain, miscommunications, learning, anticipation, and social connections. The Garniture Gallery tells the importance of beauty to each of us. It is why we decorate our homes, to make them look beautiful to us and hopefully others. Our ancestors were no different. For them, the riches of a porcelain display served as a marker of status and advertised their owners' wealth and access to international goods. Garnitures are porcelains that are made in China, or at least what we're going to see today were made in China, in sets of 3, 5, 7, or 9, and used to decorate the homes of the wealthy from the 7th century onward. They were purely for decoration rather than for a functional purpose. Commonly, they were used as a display above fireplaces or on a large cabinet. And we can see here this fireplace in Hampton Court Palace, where although this isn't a garniture, it is pieces of either porcelain or Dutch delft or English-made pottery. But the idea is it's above a fireplace, and that's where the garnitures would be displayed in these opulent homes. Today, we also buy expensive items to decorate our homes, just as our ancestors did. And here we see this large garniture in the underglazed blue palette, about 1680. And notice that it's a Chinese motif. It's a Chinese person, it's a Chinese house. It involves flowers commonly used on Chinese decoration. Another garniture in the exhibit was this underglazed blue garniture, which has a very special feature. It has this pierced decoration. Can you see my pointer? Can someone address that? I hope you can see that my pointer is pointing to the fretwork here.
Yes, we can, Shirley.
Thank you, Jack. And through the fretwork, you see that there's an interior wall. This interior wall is solid. So within each of these pieces, there's a solid tube in the center. So for example, this piece could actually accommodate flowers because it has a solid tube in which water could be placed. What is unique about this garniture is that it was particularly difficult to execute because great patience and skill was involved in the manipulation needed for the cutting and handling of the still plastic material on the outside of the piece to create the perforations needed for the effect. These fretwork objects are known as devil's work because of the extraordinary ability and time required to make them. Lastly is another underglazed blue 5-piece garniture of medium size, again, with a Chinese motif. We see a Chinese person in a boat, we see a mountain, we see fishes. What I'm emphasizing here is that in the late 1600s, what was exported to Europe and used in Europe had Chinese motifs or decorations. It was not a European decoration on these Chinese pieces. This hard-paste porcelain from China, made of ingredients not yet available in Europe, kaolin and patunce, were not only beautiful, but also had significant advantages over ceramics available to Europeans at the time. We're going to see a demonstration of this. This is a Dutch delft piece. This is the lid of the Dutch delft piece. The Dutch delft was earthenware covered with a tin glaze. When there's chipping of a Dutch delft piece, the chipping comes off showing the body of the Dutch delft piece, which is earthenware. So it's either brown or gravelly gray. So it's not really very pleasing. And the Europeans were interested in this china from China for a multitude of reasons. One of them just being when it chipped clean. And that is because the glaze was adherent to the body. Some of you may be able to think of some of the porcelain and pottery you have around your house, and you may be able to relate to this chipping business. The other advantages of the Chinese porcelain was, for example, in a teapot, when you put hot water in it, it wouldn't burst. And sometimes the other pots that were made in Europe, for example, the Dutch delft, would actually break when hot water was put in them. What we see here is that when we buy a serviceable, sensible piece, whatever it is, whether it's porcelain or something else, to use, it's one thing. But when we buy something more decorative, it's quite another. Its loveliness gives pleasure beyond simply serving a utilitarian object. This is because the perception of beauty stimulates a specific brain area. It has rich connections to the pleasure center. Now, our forebearers didn't know this, but they knew that beautiful things gave them pleasure. Recently, we found out why. This is the front of the brain to our left, and this is the back of the brain to our right. This is called the executive part of the brain, the frontal lobe. On the bottom part of the executive brain is an area that actually perceives beauty. And not only does it determine beauty for each of us, but the more we perceive something as beautiful, the more it will light up using sophisticated techniques. And this was done by Dr. Zeki at University College London. This area in the front part of the brain has rich connections to the pleasure center, which is deep in the brain. So that beauty actually, not only do we gradate it in our mind, but it gives us pleasure when we're doing this. Some of you have special art, I'm sure, in your house that you're very proud to show others. And this is what our forebearers were doing, as I said. Now let's come back to the story of how we decorate today. Actually, I'm going to jump to someone called Louisa. And you see here her palace, which is actually has to do with decorating also, but in this case, Louisa was put in a situation where she had a lot of pain. And that is because Louisa, which we see here on the left, lived in Holland. She lived in The Hague. Her parents were wealthy, and she, as a result, she lived a life of luxury. She had everything a young girl could desire. She even had a young man that she thought she was going to be marrying. But her mother and father decided that it was better for them to establish a relationship with Germany than called Brandenburg. And so they forced her to marry Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg, in 1646 on her 19th birthday. Now you can imagine what a blow this would be to a young girl. She goes to Germany. She's never even met her prospective groom. I hope she spoke the language, but I don't know that she did necessarily. She didn't know anyone, and she was just essentially torn away from her homeland and her parents and her siblings, and she had to make the best of it. Now, this would be hard for anyone. This was a loss for her. But rather than allowing herself to become distraught at this involuntary union for political purposes, Louisa propelled herself into action. Within 4 years, she was building what would become the Oranienburg Palace. It was in Dutch style, which was reminiscent of her upbringing in Holland. Now remember, she is in Germany. This Oranienburg Palace is 50 miles northwest of Berlin. Some of you may have visited it. So she is making a Dutch palace in Germany. And there's more. Not only that, she filled it with Chinese porcelain, just as she had seen her parents do. So she was making herself feel better by creating a home within a home, essentially. And also she was very active when she was doing this, obviously. Took a lot of work. After Louisa died in 1688, her son had a ceiling painted in her honor in the Oranienburg Palace. This was 1697, and it was painted by a famous painter of the time, Augustus Terreston. Now, this is the ceiling painting in the Oranienburg Palace that Louisa's son had painted to honor his mother. And he had the painter use porcelains from the room below that his mother had gathered so that they would forever be shown in this painting. And you see here the mythical Europa, and she's holding a Chinese export porcelain tea container in her left hand. And we're going to see one like this in a few moments that was in the exhibit. The figure to the left of Europa, right here, holds a large plate above her head so that only the reverse side is in view. And we'll see something like this in just a few minutes as well. Beneath Europa's dress, down here is a bowl. And again, we'll see something actually identical to this bowl soon. Below all of this is a ewer that we can't see in this painting. We're going to have to rely on a later slide. But I do want you to note this jar with lid, because that becomes important in our discussion in a few moments. So here we see the tea caddy. Notice in the painting how the stem of the leaf, of the tea leaf, is downward. And here are the tea caddies in the exhibit. Notice how the stem is upward of the tea leaf. Probably what happened here is that Augustus Terweston was on his back painting the ceiling, and he either had a sketch of a tea caddy or he had to remember it, either one. But I think he just took artistic license and painted the tea leaf as at the time he thought it should be, which makes sense. And I think that explains the difference in the orientation of the tea leaf. The Wanley plate, or the plate made about 1600, underglazed blue, was also in the exhibit, very similar to the one in the exhibit. You can see here that we have two major characters on the rim in the panels, and we have the same thing here. And I want to concentrate now on this jar with lid. This was not in the exhibit. It could not be in the exhibit. During World War II, during the end of World War II, the Allies bombed Oranienburg. And the reason we bombed it was because we wanted the war to end, and Oranienburg had an ammunition factory. It had several of them. And so in order to put an end to the Germans being able to make ammunition, they bombed Oranienburg, the whole area. Some of the Oranienburg Palace was destroyed, some was damaged. In the room where the painting was, the porcelain was gone after World War II. No one knew whether it was hopelessly damaged during the bombing or whether it was taken or what happened to it. But we do know about this one piece. This piece has a crack, which you can see here. There's a piece exactly like this, a jar with lid, in the Charlottenburg Palace, which is very near the Oranienburg Palace. And it's believed that at some point in time, though there's no record, that this must have been intact in the Oranienburg Palace after the bombing and was taken to the Charlottenburg Palace, or perhaps even before the bombing. We really don't know. Now we're going to concentrate on this bowl with panels. And you see there are two figures here. And there's a bowl really exactly like it, or almost exactly like it in the exhibit. You see the two figures, the pagoda. I think we have a pagoda here. A little different orientation, but very similar. You can see here's a tulip. Here's a tulip. It looks like this flower is on the reverse side here. Very similar, however. And at the bottom of the painting is this ewer, which we see here. Now, if you look at the decoration, this underglazed blue decoration, you can see that it does not match the ewer painted on the ceiling. In fact, to my knowledge, there's no ewer in the world that is decorated like this. It looks as though August Terweston did a good job with the shape, but he might have gotten tired. It might have been the end of the day, and he just didn't bother with the specific decoration. He just swiped a few blue lines on it. So here we have a ewer, but we do not have exact decoration. Now, what does this show us about Louisa, who had to adapt to a new land? Neuroscience recently demonstrated that our pleasure center is in a primitive area of the brain that's not under conscious control. We impulsively seek ways to stimulate it to feel good, analogous to an endorphin high. On the reverse side, we seek to avoid the opposite of pleasure, pain. Louisa did this in the only way she knew how in a country foreign to her. She made herself busy and built a palace that reminded her of home. I just want to take a minute to talk about depression, which is lack of serotonin in the brain. And you see here, for example, if this is a normal brain with a normal amount of serotonin and norepinephrine, this would show depression, less serotonin, norepinephrine. And with treatment, which commonly today would be drug treatment, we see a restoration to normal serotonin and norepinephrine. But we also know today that exercise will increase to at least some degree serotonin in the brain. And so this is what Louisa, not knowing anything about biochemistry, must have been doing. She was throwing herself into activity, and in doing so, she almost certainly felt better. Today, we all do the same thing. I can't tell you how many people I know that have projects, and when they are finished with one project, they just go to another. And part of that is because it makes us feel good to accomplish something, but also in accomplishing something, if we have a tendency toward being sad or depressed, it pushes it away. Initially, the forms and decoration of the porcelain imported to the West reflected traditional East Asian aesthetics, as we saw in Gallery 1 and 2. And I was emphasizing the underglazed blue and the Chinese motifs. However, as the trade matured, buyers of Chinese porcelain were requesting porcelain made in the East that reflected their own Western taste. This meant they started requesting European symbols unknown to the Chinese artisans who were decorating porcelain. Most of the errors were made along the lines of armorial errors or religious misinterpretations. The Chinese were familiar with neither. Their religion was not a Christian religion by and large, except what the Jesuits brought in, and that was only a minority of the Chinese that converted. And certainly they weren't familiar with armorial symbols that were typical of Europeans. For example, here we see an armorial of a family called Troutbeck. And we see on the left that this shield is red. And we see these horizontal lines left to right. We see on the right the Troutbeck Memorial 5 years later, 1780 from 1775, and we see now the shield is blue, which it should be because these horizontal lines are meant to represent blue in armorial speak. But of course, the Chinese person who made the decoration had no idea that this was supposed to mean blue. But the second time around, it was corrected. The second time around, the lines were not included, but it is so darling, I think, for this armorial Troutbeck to include trout and also to include a mermaid. What could be more charming than to have a Troutbeck armorial with trout and a mermaid? A common mistake due to misinterpretation between the European ordering the service, the armorial service, and the Chinese artisans is this Dobray armorial, 1755. Between 1750 and 1760, the Dobray family had 6 armorial services made for them. This is the 5th service. All of the preceding services, the first 4, were wrong. I think they were destroyed, at least the first 3 services, because we just don't have any anymore. They just aren't available. Some of the 4th service was kept by the family, and there are a few now on the market. And this is the 5th service, where Mr. Dobray was just fed up with getting armorial services that were incorrect. So what he did was he painted red where red should be located, green where green should be located, and he had great hopes that the service would come back correct. But the service didn't come back correct. The 5th armorial service actually had mistakes again. And you see here where Mr. Dobray had indicated red, it was painted green. So another disappointment for this family. However, the very last service was correct. Now, the religious service plates and tea sets were also a problem for the Chinese people. You see here a cup which shows the crucifixion of Christ. And when we see a close-up of the cup, we see the N is backwards. And we also see that Christ himself is very Chinese looking, which makes sense because the Chinese were not familiar with Europeans. So naturally, Christ would look Chinese. This is the saucer that goes with the cup. And apparently someone else did the decoration because the N is correct here. This shows that so many people were working on Chinese porcelain in China, that up to 80 different Chinese would work on one plate or one cup or one soup tureen or whatever. They essentially had a factory. They were probably the first factory, even before Josiah Wedgwood, in terms of making a product. Here you see something totally different. This was a Chinese export saucer that was decorated in Europe. So the saucer itself was Chinese, but it came over blank and a European decorated it. We see something quite different from the other pieces. We see now the inscription being perfectly done, and we see that Christ looks European. We see properly John and Mary at the base of the cross. So there's a lot of difference between a Chinese decorated and a European decorated Christ. Now, what does this indicate to us? I've only shown you a few of the miscommunications in terms of Chinese porcelain. There must be, I must have in my file probably 25, maybe 30 of them. And there are a lot more that I just haven't discovered yet or aren't known. These miscommunications occurred because we see what we know. In other words, past knowledge influences our sense of perception. New research is consistent with this concept. Everything from faces of people, cars, birds, anything looks significantly different to people familiar with them compared to those who are not. In other words, what we see depends on our understanding of the subject or lack thereof. Now imagine these Chinese painters doing the best they could, and I think you can appreciate how hard they were trying when the person who decorated the Dobray plate not only made the color that he thought the area should be, but also copied the letters that the European Mr. Dobray had put in. He was obviously trying very hard. Now let's look at what we see. We see here 12, 13, 14. We see here ABC. And now we see that the 13 and the B are exactly the same. But when we see these in context, whether we see them in numbers or in letters, we know what they mean. We know that this between A and C is a B, and we know that this, even though it's the same as the number over here, or the, I guess I should say the letter over here, we know what it means because over here it's a number and over here it's a letter. But a person from a foreign land might not know that. So because we were born in the United States and we were trained, we understand what is common knowledge to us, but not to someone else. Miscommunications obviously still are occurring all the time. We read about them in the paper and so on. And as long as we're different cultures brought up differently, this probably will continue for some time. Dating Chinese porcelain is often challenging. but the learning associated with it is an important part of connoisseurship, which collectors enjoy. For example, inclusion in paintings is a helpful way to date porcelain. Here we see a Koff painting, 1660, and you see this Chinese piece called a magic fountain ewer, also in the exhibit. This Chinese piece had to be made before 1660, or it couldn't be in Koff's painting. Actually, it was made around 1580. We know that from other documentary evidence, but the fact that it's in Koff's 1660 painting indicates to us it was made before then and just confirms what we already know. The same thing for this Chinese jar, Koff's 1669 painting. It had to be made before 1669. It was made before 1643. We know that from shipwreck evidence because one of these, or many of these, were in a shipwreck called the Hatcher shipwreck of 1643. We're going to look at one piece from a shipwreck, the Cao Mau shipwreck, and this is the piece. You'll notice that this teapot from the Cao Mau shipwreck, 1723, that was in water for more than 200 years, brought up, it was brought up actually not too long ago, and the sale was at Sotheby's, probably, I would say 6 to 10 years ago. Probably brought up much before the auction, however, within 10, 20 years of the auction. But what we see here is the glaze is worn off because of the water constantly flowing over the piece at the bottom of the sea. And we also see some accretion area, some brown area, whether it's a rock that was against it or tea, we don't know. We also see what looks like some missing decoration. We see the underglaze blue, but we wonder, was there more there that we're supposed to be seeing? Well, yes, there was. And I just want to show you something that that was not underwater and that contains the original underglaze blue here, but also the iron red enamel and the gold decoration. And if we look at this so-called patty pan, which might be under the teapot that we saw, this piece is also from the Cao Mau. And if you concentrate in this area here above the lattice work, which you see here, these two are the same. You see a ghost pattern. And this ghost pattern is what was here where the enamels and the gold was placed. This is a flower, and here you have a branch. And so if you have any pieces where the glaze is rubbed off, and if it has a ghost pattern, it strongly suggests that it was underwater for some time. Also, dates on porcelain and coats of arms tell us when pieces were made. I want to concentrate on this anniversary teapot, 1774. It is actually part of a tea set that I obtained in the 1990s from a dealer in London at a fair. He was a Norwegian dealer, and he had just obtained this part tea set from a Norwegian family who either needed money or who no longer had feelings about this particular anniversary set. In 1774, the Norwegian couple that it belonged to received this as an anniversary present, their 25th anniversary. It remained in that family until the 1990s when it was sold to the Norwegian dealer. And so only 2 owners have had this in their possession. The original couple and their family, their lineage, I should say many owners, but 2 families, and me. I think it's very special because it's a part tea set. It has, I can't remember, 17, 27 pieces. It's still together. It's a part of our history. If it were sold to a dealer, it would probably be broken up and sold piece by piece and would no longer have that charm that it had originally. I just love tea sets like this that are so special and deserve, in my mind, to be kept together because of what they represent. The Norwegian dealer who sold it to me actually, I think, thought the same thing because he gave me a page, typewritten, single space, about the family that owned this tea set. Here are two armorial pieces, and we know because when armorials were recorded, the East India Company that negotiated the deal would keep records. So we know when armorials were made, and they can be dated in that way. Now, all of this indicates learning. And I dare say we're all here today because we love learning. In fact, our ancestors loved learning too, because we've made so many advances in the last 400 years because they did love learning. But now we know why. We know the scientific reason. Adults exhibit a specific excitatory brainwave pattern when they think they're about to learn something new. And this, again, is connected to the pleasure center. What is the most surprising thing, and this just represents these excitatory brainwaves, is that infants as young as 11 months of age also exhibit the same excitatory response when they think they're about to learn. So the love of learning starts at a young age, and aren't we lucky that we have that capacity? The Dutch dominated the East-West porcelain trade in the 17th century through the Dutch East India Company. In the 18th century, as other companies entered the market, the Dutch looked for ways to remain competitive. To this end, in 1734, the Dutch East India Company hired Dutch artist Cornelius Pronk to make drawings to be used on porcelain that was executed in China. The resulting product was expected to be sold in Europe at a steep markup. In other words, the directors of the Dutch East India Company anticipated a profit. Pronk created at least 4 different designs, the most famous of which is the Parasol Ladies. We see Pronk's design here on the left, and we see the resulting piece that was executed in China that was brought back to Europe to be sold, but unfortunately for the Dutch East India Company, could not be sold at the profit that they had wished. The Chinese could execute something Chinese less expensively than they could something that Europeans ordered, because they didn't really understand what Europeans were ordering. And although this looks very Chinese to us, it evidently didn't look that Chinese to the Chinese. We see here a tour de force using one of Pronk's designs. It's called the hand washing. And this is a huge cistern. And it was used to wash hands at the end of a meal. So the hand washing on this is particularly appropriate. You see the spigot? This was added in Europe. And there was a valve here that you could turn and the water would come on. And if you turned it another way, the water would be turned off. Even more of a tour de force was this huge 26 3/4 inch bell cistern with the Archer design. And you see here is a place for the spigot to be located, but none was ever put in, probably because this piece was so revered that it was decided not to use it, not to make it functional. Now, what do we learn from this? The Dutch anticipated a profit. Anticipating what we want actually stimulates our pleasure center more than receiving it. This is interesting. I think that we can reflect on this in our own life. For example, if we plan on going on a vacation, we have the joy and the pleasure of planning it all out. You know, what transportation we'll take, what hotels we'll stay in, what our family will do when we're visiting the desired cities. And then when we actually start our vacation at our first hotel, for example, we find they don't have a reservation. So that's a disappointment. But that doesn't ablate all the pleasure that we had in planning our vacation. So this is the same way as collecting. When we purchase pieces, we anticipate purchasing what we want. And it is so exciting to think about it. Once we get it, however, our pleasure center quiets, and then some collectors have to have another hit. They have to buy another piece of porcelain or another artwork rather quickly to feel satisfied. This is the last gallery. Tea and coffee began to be enjoyed in Europe in the 17th century. In the next 400 years, their popularity spread, and they were widely consumed across the continent. This meant that new forms had to be developed to serve as vessels for tea and coffee. Wine ewers, too, made in China, changed in character. So we're going to quickly just go through some tea sets. This is a tea set 1720. You can see how plain it is. It just has underplain glazed blue with some Femme vert or green and orange pattern on it. It is only a teapot. There's no coffee pot yet in the set. And then we see 1735 to 40, everything is becoming more ornate, actually more, for me, more beautiful. Let's look at this saucer right here. Let's look at the underneath part of that saucer. You can see that there's molding, vine molding. And when you look at the top portion, you see how specific the painting is. You see how there's gradation in the pink. You see the caterpillar done beautifully. So the tea sets were becoming more ornate and more opulent. By 1759, the tea sets were becoming tea and coffee sets. Here we have 2 teapots and we have a coffee pot. And also there were many more armorials because the Westerners were then ordering armorials, as we saw previously. And in 1790, we have tea and coffee sets that were even reflecting European sets, because this bullet, not drum shape, not bullet, this drum teapot is like a silver drum teapot. So now the Chinese were following what the Europeans were doing because the Europeans were ordering it. The tea, coffee, and wine offered social interaction. When we get together with someone, we don't say, oh, come over and we'll sit down and talk. We say, oh, come over for tea, or come over for coffee, or come over for a drink. These beverages have come to be an excuse to get together. So this social interaction that they provide gives more than pleasure. It's actually important for health. Those who have regular communal contact compared to social isolation not only live longer, but also have better medical indicators of overall health. And I want to show you a chart of a large study that indicates this. We see on the vertical axis, we see health indicators, and we see on the horizontal axis, isolation. And the more isolated someone is, the poorer their health is. So when we meet for beverages, we're actually improving our health. And Carnegie Hill Village is doing this, has provided so many opportunities for interaction. And I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm so laudatory toward our group. In closing, I just want to say that this has demonstrated that there is a place for science and art. It's an ongoing thing now. For example, medical students are in some universities required actually to take art courses because it's thought it increases their powers of observation. Also in hospitals now, studies are being done as to what art can make patients feel more comfortable. That can only help, I think, patient care. In fact, certain kinds of art in hospital rooms can actually make patients get better faster, which is unbelievable. But that has been demonstrated with studies. So I want to thank you for coming today to listen to the interaction of art and science and how we can learn from art in an easier way, I think, than we can, for example, reading a scientific book.
Thank you, Shirley, very much for a most illuminating talk. I can't quite see everyone, but are there questions? Would you raise your hand? If there are questions.
Sarah Coffin, you don't have a question? I'm catching her off guard.
Yeah. Sorry, I had my mute on because I didn't want it at any rate, so I didn't focus that the mute was still on. Thank you, Shirley. That was wonderful and as always very insightful. But I suppose I was curious as to something that in terms of science as to whether you thought about what the role of how blue impacted people in the West. Obviously, it was for technical reasons or whatever. I mean, it was made in China, but do you think the color itself had different impact on Chinese versus Europeans?
The Chinese evidently didn't like it. I'm sure you know that they didn't care for it in their own country, in spite of the fact that they were making it for Islamic countries and for European countries. But evidently, over centuries, they began to like it. Mm-hmm. So initially, they made it for foreigners, but they ended up accepting it as their own.
But I guess the fact that it was so desirable to have this porcelain from the East, one wonders if it didn't affect Europeans' attitudes towards blue. I mean, or at least the people who wanted porcelain to show off what they had from the East. So, I mean, I wonder if they ended up liking blue better or sooner than the Chinese did. Is there any knowledge about how blue is sort of perceived in terms of decorative schemes?
Obviously, or it's well liked, and even today people use blue and white. You know, you look at a catalog like Scully and Scully, or a catalog from the San Francisco store that is no longer open.
Right. Yeah.
But they contain blue and white generously because people like to use them to decorate. They catch the eye. And they're easy to decorate with. They're easier than color because I have both in this house. And the blue and white is so much easier to use. So I think that's part of it too. Good point.
Shirley, it's Jack. Continuing the blue and white discussion, as you talked, I'm more and more convinced that what we have is in fact blue Delft, which is not Chinese export, but the reason we've always thought it was Chinese export is it's covered with Oriental patterns on it, and so did the Dutch sort of pick up on that and start doing forged?
I'd hate to call it forged. They just admired what the Chinese were doing, and it was selling, so they naturally knew that they wanted to get into the market.
I see. And
I don't think I call it forged, but you may be interested in a company in Amsterdam, the Aronson company, Aronson. They have wonderful pieces, and he might look at your pieces sometime when he comes to New York to a show. Robert Aronson.
What struck in my mind from early in your presentation was talking about the difference in the chips of the two kinds of the porcelain versus the other stuff. We clearly have the orange kind of chip on the number of the pieces. So that was very helpful. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, Dutch Delft is good to have as well as Chinese porcelain. So I think you're a lucky man.
Are there any other questions? Okay, if not, Shirley, once again, I want to say thank you very much for a most interesting and engaging talk. For the members of the Carnegie Hill Village, our next lecture will be on a very different subject, Courier and Ives. That is March 30th, I believe. And then, and I know that many of you signed up for it. And then in April, we're hoping to have a tour of Seneca Village, either via Zoom or actually in person, meaning a walk, and also a Zoom tour of the Amazing You exhibition events at the new Museum of Contemporary Art. So please stay tuned and have a wonderful afternoon. Enjoy the extended sunlight. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.